Hello and welcome! Thank you for joining me today to learn about my very favorite subject, the Terra Nova Expedition! I'm Sarah Eris and I'm doing a graphic novel about the expedition. And so today I've boiled down the very bare essentials of the story and unfortunately left out a lot of my favorite bits. But hopefully it will get you interested in the story and you can learn more about it if you want to. So, very briefly, the Terra Nova Expedition, or the British Antarctic Expedition 1910, which was its proper name, was led by Captain Scott, who had been to Antarctica once before in 1901 with the Discovery. They had two goals. First, to continue the science begun on Scott's first expedition, and second, to reach the South Pole, which no one had done before. The expedition is named after the ship they used, the Terra Nova, built in Dundee in 1884. Every nation in Britain was represented in the crew, as well as Canada, Australia, Norway, and Russia. They all assembled in Cardiff in June of 1910 and sailed on the 15th of June. Now, it takes a long time to get to Antarctica in a sailing ship, and they made many stops along the way, including in South Africa and Australia. When they stopped in Melbourne, in Australia, Scott received news that someone else was trying to reach the South Pole, a Norwegian explorer named Roald Amundsen. But the expedition was already underway, and there was nothing they could do about it, so they pressed on. To New Zealand. They loaded up on all their supplies that they would need for 2 whole years in Antarctica, in New Zealand. Because you can't just nip to the shops when you're in Antarctica. You have to bring everything you could possibly need with you. So you have to think of all that before you leave, and New Zealand was their last place to pick up supplies. So finally, 5 months after leaving Cardiff, they were finally on their way to Antarctica. Now, I'm going to have some maps to show you, but I need you to get your bearings first. So this is how we usually see Antarctica. In this view, if you keep going up from the top of the image, you get to Britain. But Scott was going to the part of Antarctica where you can sail a ship closest to the South Pole, which is on the other side of the continent facing New Zealand. So, we need to see Antarctica like this. In this view, New Zealand is up, as you can see here. There's New Zealand next to Australia. The Terra Nova sailed down to the Ross Sea and landed on Ross Island at the edge of the Ross Ice Shelf. You'll never guess the name of the guy who discovered this part of Antarctica. From here, their journey to the pole would cross the ice shelf, which was the size of France, climb the Transantarctic Mountains, and travel over the interior to reach the pole. So having the map this way around puts the South Pole at the bottom, which is where we're used to seeing south, and makes it much easier to understand their motions. So they landed in January, which is summer in Antarctica, when the temperature is really only just around freezing, and they set up their base camp at a place called Cape Evans on Ross Island. They unloaded the ship and built their hut, as you can see in this picture, as quickly as possible, because they needed to start preparing for the next summer's journey to the pole. This meant taking a load of supplies out along the route you saw in the last slide, so they didn't need to carry everything from base camp the next year. Now, the seasons change very quickly in Antarctica, and they got there in the middle of summer, so they only had the second half of summer left to do this work. Fuel and food for both men and animals were laid in depots along the route, and about 150 miles from Cape Evans, with the season beginning to turn, they left the rest of what they were carrying in one great big final depot they called a 1-ton depot, and then turned back to get home before the summer weather ran out. Winter in Antarctica is 24-hour nighttime and very, very cold, so the 25 men were mostly confined to the hut. All these guys lived in that house that you see behind them. What I love most about this story is the people, and every single one of them was interesting and played a unique role in the expedition, but I'm going to introduce you to 6 of them in particular who are very important to the story. Captain Scott was the leader, obviously. He came from the Navy, but this was not a naval expedition. It was privately financed, mostly by him and his fundraising. It was a crowd-funded expedition, actually. His first expedition, the Discovery expedition, had been a career move, but on that expedition he got really excited about polar science, and that motivated him to launch the second expedition. Dr. Wilson had also been on Scott's first expedition, and came back this time as supervisor of the scientists, as well as being a zoologist himself and an artist. Lieutenant Teddy Evans, those are his initials, Erger, but his nickname was Teddy, he had been planning his own expedition, but he teamed up with the more famous Scott in exchange for the position of second in command in Scott's expedition. So he held this position of second in command, but everyone basically considered Wilson, who was Scott's very good friend, to be the real second in command. Bowers, nicknamed Birdie for his enormous nose, had been in charge of stores on the ship, and he impressed Scott so much with his organizational skills that he was invited to land and keep doing the same job in Antarctica. He was only 5'4", and he hardly felt the cold, and he was pretty much everyone's favorite guy. Dr. Atkinson was the chief medical doctor, whose job it was to keep everyone healthy. When he wasn't doing that, he was studying parasites and microorganisms. Apsley Cherry Garrard, or Cherry for short, was brought on to be an assistant for Dr. Wilson with his zoological work. He was one of the youngest members of the party and had no experience with expeditions at all. He was just a few years out of university, but he was very keen and very happy to be part of this whole adventure. There was still a lot of science that could be done at the base. So here we see, here's the physicist with a telescope, and there's some marine biology happening with a net through the ice, and there's a geologist. He's sanding down one of his samples to get a nice smooth slice, so you can see the rock sample. Those who weren't occupied with science made preparations for the next year's exploration. So these guys are sewing sleeping bags out of reindeer skin. And then at midwinter, which is in June in Antarctica, they had a big Christmas party with presents and dancing and just a little bit of alcohol. It was a good time. Shortly after that midwinter party, Wilson, Bowers, and Cherry set out on a perilous journey. In the middle of winter, they were crazy. Emperor penguins lay their eggs in the winter, and Wilson thought that getting some embryos might prove some interesting things about the evolution of birds. But because they're incubated in the winter, no one had ever studied them before. The trip was absolutely horrible. In fact, it gave Cherry's book its name, which you'll see at the end of this lecture. Temperatures down to -77 and winds that blew their tent away, and they just barely managed to scrape their way back alive, but they survived. Now, when the sun came back in the spring, they were ready to set out for the pole. Scott's plan was for a large group to set off from base, and then at prearranged points, various supporting parties would turn back, leaving the final small party to go all the way to the pole. So not everyone would get to the pole, it was just they were kind of helping pull stuff for the other guys. The first part of the route was crossing the ice shelf, and then they would climb the mountains via the Beardmore Glacier. You can see where the path bends there, that's the Beardmore Glacier. 100-mile-long river of ice through the mountains. At the top of the glacier there was another snow plain all the way to the pole. 4 forms of transport had a part in the plan. The motor sledges went first, with 4 men, led by Teddy Evans, who's the farthest right in that bottom photo. He's got the balaclava on. He's also the leading guy in the top photo, but you can't really see his face in that one. No one had used tracked vehicles in Antarctica before. They were very experimental, but they could pull a lot of weight, and Scott believed that they were the future of polar travel. So the idea was to see how far they could go, and then when they gave out, the men would take those supplies the rest of the way on foot. The sledges only made 50 miles, but they did well enough to prove that there was potential in the design. The 4 men hauled the cargo the rest of the way, and then they made a depot which they piled high with snow and called Mount Hooper after the youngest and tallest man in the party, who's the one standing next to Teddy in the picture. They waited at Mount Hooper for the main party to catch up. So the main party used Siberian ponies, and everyone goes, why on earth would you take ponies to Antarctica? Are you stupid? But they were Siberian ponies. They were evolved to live in the coldest part of the northern hemisphere in eastern Russia, and the people there had used them for centuries for hauling freight through the very deep snow. I mean, they literally get like 10 feet of snow where these ponies live. So they were not as stupid a decision as most people seem to think. They're actually ideally suited to this work. The main party consisted of 10 men, each leading a pony with a sledge. And as the ponies wore out, they were shot and fed to the dogs, who we will see in the next slide. When the main party caught up with the motor party, who you just saw, they took Teddy Evans and another man from the motor party, and the other 2 members of the motor party went back home. So by the time they reached the Beardmore Glacier, all the ponies had been eaten by the dogs, so they divided up into 3 groups of 4 to pull the sledges up the glacier themselves. This is called man-hauling, which you can see in the lower picture, and was the 3rd mode of transport. The plan was for 1 and then another party of 4 to turn back after assisting the effort to the pole, leaving 1 team to go all the way. The dog teams were fastest, but they weren't as reliable, and they were more valuable for quick trips than the long haul. So if you needed to go somewhere really quickly, you take the dogs, and if you definitely needed to get there, you would walk or take a pony or something. They assisted the main party to the foot of the Beardmore Glacier, then turned back to base, where their job would be restocking the depots along the route for the returning parties to pick up on their way home, then coming out to meet the last party as they returned from the pole. Everything started off according to plan. Crossing the ice shelf went smoothly. These are some photos I took from a plane flying over the ice shelf, so you can get an idea how big and empty it is. It's just absolutely enormously flat and white. The dots you see in the second picture are massive tractors hauling drilling equipment, so you can imagine how much tinier the pony sledges were in this great big white nothing. Those tractors, by the way, are the giant modern versions of Scott's motor sledges, so he wasn't wrong about the future. There was a very heavy snowstorm, which is very unusual for Antarctica, when they reached the foot of the Beardmore Glacier, and that pinned them in their tents for a few days. Then instead of hauling the sledges up nice slippery ice like you can see in this photo, they had to drag them through deep wet snow. The Beardmore is a huge glacier, and it's not very steep, so it's a great way to cut through the mountains. As you can see, some parts of it are smooth, and some parts are very jumbly. The jumbly parts are crevasses, enormous cracks in the ice that can be hundreds of feet deep. This picture looks like I was standing on the surface, but I was actually 1,000 feet up in an aeroplane, just to give you a sense of scale. I mean, the cracky bit in the foreground is like the size of a small city. It's absolutely massive. At the top of the Beardmore Glacier, they reached the polar plateau, the ice cap in the interior of the continent, and it was flat again to the pole, but much colder. Here at the top of the Beardmore Glacier, the first returning party turned back north. It was led by Dr. Atkinson, and also included Cherry, who was disappointed not to go all the way to the pole, but was still suffering the effects of the winter journey, so it's probably just as well that he left. The remaining 8 men continued south until halfway to the pole, then the second returning party turned back, led by Teddy Evans. These guys are going to turn up again in a few minutes, so keep them in mind. When Teddy's party turned back, Scott, Wilson, Bowers, and 2 other men went the rest of the way to the pole, where they found that Amundsen had beaten them to it by a month. That's Amundsen's tent that they're all gathered around there. Very definite proof that Norway had beaten Britain to the pole. They were, of course, disappointed, but they knew they had done what they set out to do, and had been doing good science along the way. So they took some photos to prove that they were there, and then turned back for home. And that was when things started to go wrong. First, the wind failed. Most of the time, air flows off the continent towards the sea, and Scott's plans counted on this reliable south wind to push the parties home. The photo is the first returning party arriving back at Cape Evans, and you can see how they rigged a sail on their sledge to catch the wind. Sometimes they wouldn't even have to pull at all, they just had to steer the sledge. So when the polar party were making their return journey, there was no wind, and they were expecting there to be some, so they had to pull the sledge all themselves. There's no help. Second, a temperature inversion. Warm air is lighter than cold air, so it will rise above it if it's allowed to. Wind will stir up the levels of air and keep the warm air circulating. Because it was calm, the air was no longer being stirred up, so the air closest to the ice kept getting colder and colder, and the air warmed by the sun stayed floating on top. Walking on the surface of the ice, Scott and his team were stuck in the cold air. Because of the lack of wind, they were colder than expected and had no help pulling their sledge. Then injuries. The strongest man in the party, also named Evans, I know, confusing, got concussion in a fall as they were coming down the Beardmore, and he died near the bottom. Another man, Titus Oates, started to get really bad frostbite, where bits of your body freeze and eventually die. But they were still many hundreds of miles from home, and a long way from where the dogs were supposed to meet them as planned. Meanwhile, back at Cape Evans, the first returning party had arrived safely, and Dr. Atkinson was preparing to take the dogs out to meet the returning polar party. Just as he was about to head out, a member of the second returning party arrived with news that their leader, Teddy Evans, was dying of scurvy. Atkinson was the doctor, and it was his job to save Teddy Evans' life, so he couldn't go meet the polar party with the dogs as planned. Instead, he gave the job to Cherry, with instructions to meet the polar party at One Ton Depot, which is where they were expected to be by the time he got there. If the polar party wasn't there yet, then he should decide what to do. Cherry reached One Ton on March 4th, at which point the delayed polar party were still over 100 miles away. The visibility and weather were bad, so Cherry decided to wait for them to arrive at this well-known location, rather than strike out into the vast empty flatness and possibly miss them. While Cherry was waiting at One Ton, the polar party reached Mount Hooper, and discovered that it had less food and fuel than they were expecting. The fuel was especially important because in order to get any water to drink, they had to melt snow, and hot food kept up their stamina. The day after the polar party reached Mount Hooper, Cherry, who had been waiting for a week in bad weather at One Ton Depot, with food for the dogs running out, decided to turn back. He left some extra food and fuel at One Ton for the polar party to pick up when they arrived. Titus Oates had been suffering from frostbite in his feet since the Beardmore Glacier. As time went on, his feet got worse and worse, so the party slowed down in order for him to keep up. After Mount Hooper, he knew that slowing down the party was putting them in danger, and he asked them to leave him behind to die, but they refused to abandon their friend. On March 16th, they were stuck in their tent in a blizzard. Oates left the tent in the morning and didn't come back. 2 days later, Scott started getting frostbite in his right foot. He hobbled on for another day, and they made camp a day's journey from One Ton Depot. The next morning they woke to a raging blizzard, so no traveling today, but they only had 2 days' worth of food and fuel left. Wilson and Bowers, the two on the right, planned to make the long walk to One Ton for food and fuel, which was their last hope for survival, but the blizzard just didn't stop. So with their fuel slowly running out, they wrote letters to their families and eventually died of cold and starvation. Scott's last diary entry is dated March 29th. Back at Cape Evans, no one knew what had happened to the polar party, only that they hadn't returned. Most thought that they had fallen down a crevasse on the Beardmore Glacier. Teddy Evans had gone back on the Terra Nova when she came down to resupply the base, and Scott and Wilson were missing, so Atkinson was left in charge. After his time at One Ton Depot, Cherry was completely exhausted and spent much of the winter in bed with a strained heart and migraines, and Atkinson, being doctor, tended to him all winter. Half the hut was empty, and blizzards raged the whole time, so it was just a horrible winter for everyone, but especially Cherry. But they decided they owed it to their friends and to their friends' families to find out what had happened to the missing polar party, so as soon as the sun returned, they set off again to the south. 12.5 miles south of One Ton Depot, they found the polar party's tent covered in snow, with the bodies of Scott, Wilson, and Bowers inside. Scott's diary told them the story of what happened since the second returning party left them, when they were beaten to the pole, and then everything went wrong on the return journey. The search party collapsed the tent over the bodies and built this snow cairn over it. They held a memorial service and then turned back to Cape Evans, and when the ship came to pick them up, brought the story back to the world. Nearly all of them were involved in the First World War. They got back to Britain in 1913, and the war broke out in 1914. There really wasn't much time between them. Cherry was invalided home from the war in 1916, and started writing up an account of the expedition, which became his book, The Worst Journey in the World. In 2008, it was broadcast as a radio drama on Radio 4, and I got hooked on the story, especially the characters. It was so inspiring to me how, when everything went wrong, they were still so kind to each other and helped each other instead of getting nasty. And I needed to know that people could do that. You see a lot of nastiness in the world. You don't see a lot of kindness, and they were so inspiring in that regard. So 100 years later, I am turning Cherry's book into a graphic novel, so that this amazing story and their example can reach more people. So, how do you make a graphic novel? Well, the first part is lots and lots of research. I had read Cherry's book, of course, but in order to draw it, I needed to fill in some blanks and get a broader view of the expedition. So reading other people's accounts and letters and diaries, and even look at Cherry's own diaries, which are kept at the Scott Polar Research Institute in Cambridge. It's one thing to write about what happened, but to draw it, I need to know what everything looks like. So I visited lots of museums to see the actual stuff they used and the clothes they wore so that I could draw it accurately. I also visited places they'd been. I went to New Zealand and got to hang out in the port where the Terra Nova left from. There's also some good museums there and some good documents, so multitasking. The Terra Nova is no longer afloat, but Scott's first expedition ship, the Discovery, is now a museum in Dundee, so I spent a few days there, just getting a feel for how a polar ship was put together and what it feels like to be on it. I also went on a sailing trip of my own to learn how a tall ship worked on the actual sea. And then, last year, I finally went all the way to Antarctica to see the actual places where the history happened. Obviously, it was important to see them, to be able to draw them, but it was also really valuable to learn what Antarctica feels like, the realities of day-to-day life there, plus getting to know scientists who are doing the same sort of work there now that the Terra Nova scientists were doing in 1910. Much advanced, of course. I got to visit nearly everywhere I needed to draw, including Cape Crozier, where Wilson, Bowers, and Cherry went in the middle of winter. Did I mention they were insane? They camped where it says igloo there. They built a little igloo out of stones. This is such a desolate, windy ridge in the middle of nowhere. I knew their trip was bad from the book. I mean, it gave the worst journey in the world its name. But being there myself, in comparatively good weather, gave me a whole new perspective on what they went through in the name of science. I also got to fly over the Beardmore Glacier. You already saw one of my photos of it, but this one was especially important to me. This is the base of the glacier where the dog teams left the main party, and roughly where Taff Evans died on the way back down. There's only one photo of this place from the expedition, so being able to see the real thing was a thrill, and it will make such a difference when it comes to drawing it. In the upper left, that's the only picture they have of this spot from the expedition. So being able to have that bird's eye view of it, it makes all the difference in the world. And of course there's the Terra Nova hut at Cape Evans where everyone lived. So that's me in the upper left standing next to Cherry's and Bowers' bunk. Bowers was on top, Cherry was on the bottom. Then there's the main communal table where everyone worked and ate. It was incredible to be in their space, and I found so many wonderful details everywhere, including Bowers' hat! His hat is still there! Oh my gosh! People had told me I couldn't properly draw the book or even really understand the story until I'd been to Antarctica, and having been there now, I definitely agree with them. I mean, I have a pretty good imagination, but it does not compare to the real thing. Another kind of research is art research, finding a style that suits the story. It's an epic tragedy, so a really cartoony style isn't appropriate, but it's also really emotional, so the style has to be expressive and sympathetic. It can't be really stiff and awkward. For the environments, I really like the simplicity of Japanese woodblock prints, which really suit the austerity of Antarctica, while allowing color to play a very emotional role. So, having been an animator, I was confident drawing the characters, but I had to put a lot of time into learning the style of woodblock prints to recreate it for my book. So characters, that's my aquarium. These were real people, so I had to make them look like they really looked. So I'm doing this to honor them, so I wanted to be true to their likenesses. So I always started with a collection of photographs showing different angles and expressions. And then I made sketches off the photos to understand what was happening in them and really get how these people are put together and what makes them look like them. And then I did my own versions to see if I had them figured out. That's Dr. Atkinson, by the way, who you might recognize from the photographs. I also made reference for myself to understand the ship, the Terra Nova. Most of the first book takes place on the ship, so I had to figure out where everything was in relation to each other. And if I could walk around the ship in my head, then I could be confident staging the action as people moved around the ship on the page, and these planning drawings helped to keep all the details consistent. Then there's writing. I laid out the expedition timeline so I didn't miss anything, and tracked various subplots over time. It's history, so I don't need to make anything up, but as a writer, I need to decide which threads of the story are central to understanding what happened, and what details can be cut for clarity or length. Then I come back to the original book, Cherry's book, with my supplemental research and story engineering, and figure out how to translate it into visual form, starting with the script. Once I've written the script, I do tiny little sketches to plan the comics pages. They're called thumbnails because each little drawing is literally the size of a thumbnail. These rectangles are about 5 by 8 centimeters. And then, there's all the little drawings within them. So working small means I can try out a lot of different ideas without investing too much in the individual drawings. Like if it doesn't work, I can erase it and I haven't lost an hour's worth of careful drawing. I just draw a new drawing in 30 seconds. And that allows me to try out a bunch of stuff and make it work. So when the thumbnails are working, I draw everything out on a page of A3, which gives me space to draw details comfortably. I do the rough working out sketch in red, and then when I know what I want to draw, I do the final line in black. And then when I scan it into Photoshop, I can tell the computer to erase the red lines, and I'm just left with my clean black lines, I look like I know what I'm doing from the beginning. So these clean black lines I color in the computer, which is much faster than doing it on paper, and allows me to mess up, which I do a lot. And then I have finished color pages. Now I just have to do this 146 more times. So that's what I've been doing over lockdown. I am just starting to color Volume 1, which is a grand adventure, and I think that I have some pages to share with you, which I hope the Scottish Book Trust has arranged to get to you. Thank you so much for your interest today. I hope you've learned something interesting and are inspired to learn more about polar exploration. There's so much good stuff out there. Thank you and goodbye!